As a visual description, I'm a white woman with brown curly hair sitting in a room with a bookshelf behind me. And I think Sophia already gave my introduction, but just to briefly reiterate, I am a 7th-year PhD student in the Laboratory of Social Evolution and Behavior at Rockefeller University, where I also study ants, although not the research that I'm going to talk about today. When I'm not doing or talking about science, I love to be in nature and appreciate all kinds of plants. I like to make visual art of my own upon occasion and spend time with my partner. And I also do some work with Rockefeller's LGBTQ+ organization called Rock Out. So the paper we're going to talk about today is titled Colony Expansions Underlie the Evolution of Army Ant Mass Breeding. And I'll explain what all that means shortly. I also want to mention that this work was done in the same lab that I currently work in. And although I wasn't involved in this work myself, I did get to watch the science unfold, which was really cool. So the authors for this paper are Vikram Chandra, Asaf Gal, and Daniel Cronauer, all of whom I know, and Daniel Cronauer is also my boss. This paper was published in a journal called The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, usually called PNAS, and it came out in 2021 as an open access article. The funding for this research came from multiple sources, including both the US government and private institutions, just to give you an idea of the framework that led to this science coming into the world. So let's start off by thinking about food. Do you know where your food came from? And how much of it did you grow or catch yourself? I'm going to guess the answer is not that much. Just looking at an American city like New York, where I live, you can see there's clearly way more space devoted to people doing their business activities, living their lives, housing, than there is to food production. And that's because cities usually can't grow their own food, and so we have to get it from somewhere else. So we have complex systems for making sure that enough food gets produced, transported, and made available for everyone to eat it. And those systems have their own sorts of problems, but I think we can agree that they provide more food than if everyone had to go out and get their own every single day. And humans aren't the only organisms that find themselves in a similar situation. Animals like ants can have huge populations and need specialized systems to make sure that everyone gets fed. This is a colony of army ants that have assembled themselves into a temporary nest structure by hooking their bodies together. And inside of the temporary nest, there is actually chambers where the larvae, eggs, and pupae are being taken care of. And soon the ants are going to disassemble the nest and move on to new territory. But as part of their maintaining the colony, they're going to be sending out mass raids to acquire prey to feed all of the developing young. And the temporary nest is called a bivouac, which is a word for a temporary military base. So a little more background on ants. Scientists have been fascinated by ants for centuries, and one of the big reasons is that, like humans, ants are masters of social life. We share in common a bunch of different specialized behaviors that make social living work, like building homes, caring for the young, and sharing labor, collective defense, and collective supply of food, like I mentioned. And here you can see some army ants actually on one of their raids, and they're working together to take down a much larger prey. And while humans have only been around for a couple of million years at best, ants have been living the social lifestyle for around 160 million years. So we can learn a lot about how social life works and evolves by studying the ways that different ants do it. And scientists who study ants often talk about collective behavior, so I want to explain what that term means. Collective behavior is a way for the behavior of many individuals to organize themselves. That's maybe a little different than the type of organizational structures that you might be used to thinking about. So these two diagrams show different ways for individuals in a group to interact. On the left, you've got one individual at the top, 3 in the middle, and then 6 below. And each individual is only connected to a handful of others. And you can imagine that maybe the individual at the top is actually in control of the situation, passing down instructions to others. This is how it works in the military, where you have a hierarchical chain of command with a general at the top and successive layers of commanders until you get down to individual soldiers. And each person usually is only answering to just one commander above them. And that's not how it works in ant colonies. Even though we talk about ant queens, queens really don't give out orders. They're just the ones laying the eggs. Instead, the organization of what actually determines behaviors is a little more like on the right, where you have individuals that are interacting with lots of others, influencing each other's behaviors in different ways. And there's really no individual that is in control of the situation. Instead, the group is going to make decisions based on the collective influences of everyone that's part of it. So we can talk about the structure of a non-hierarchical group as being a type of collective behavior. And one reason scientists study ants is to better understand how groups can make decisions collectively. And by studying the evolution of social organisms, we can also understand how collective behavior can evolve. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail about particular ant species now. And I've mentioned the really impressive army ants already, and now let's dive in on a particular species. So these are individuals from a type of army ant with the scientific name Eciton burchellii, which are found in the rainforests of Central and South America. And these ants have incredible variation of their morphology, with really tiny workers like this one down here, and much larger soldiers who have these huge sword-like mandibles also present in the nest. And these two individuals are sisters, even though they look so different from each other. And the total population of an Eciton burchellii colony can be 425,000 to up to 2 million individuals, which is pretty incredible. And to supply all of the food for a colony like that, these ants use a collective hunting strategy that's called mass raiding, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Now, before I go into that, I want to ask everyone a question. So all of the eggs in a army ant colony are laid by the queen, and this is the Eciton burchellii queen down here. And now that I've told you how many ants there are in a single colony, how many eggs do you think this queen can lay in a month? You can take a guess in the poll question. I'll wait a second for people to answer. Probably end the poll. All right, so actually not bad. So almost half of you got the right answer, which is that this queen can lay on the order of 100,000 eggs in a month. So pretty incredible, especially when you consider that these queens, can you see the results? Hopefully. Never sure what's showing up on the audience's screen versus just mine. These queens can live for many years. So over the course of her lifetime, army ant queens are producing just millions and millions of offspring. So now that we've answered that question, let's start talking about raiding. So this is a diagram that was drawn from a field observation of an army ant mass raid. And so these are pretty incredible behaviors that happen in the wild. And the researchers found the nest, the temporary bivouac nest of the army ants, and tracked the passage of ants down a long column, which they call the raiding column, extending dozens of meters into the forest, and then splitting into little branches that connect different food sources, ultimately back to the nest. And there are ants trafficking back and forth, carrying food. And you also have scouts along the edges of the column who are fanning out and looking for food, and then extending branches of this trail to show other ants where to go get that food they've identified. So this is a really cool behavior. It has a lot of different parts, a lot of collective activity makes it possible. But because it's so big, these ants have such large populations, and they really can't be kept in the lab, it's really not possible to do lab experiments on this kind of behavior. So it's a little hard to know exactly what are the mechanisms involved, or the behavioral rules that the ants are following to put together this complex display. But there are some army ant relatives that are much easier to study in the lab. And the best example of these are the clonal raider ants, which are also from the same ant subfamily called the Doralines. And they are found natively in Bangladesh, but have been introduced to tropical islands all around the world. And that's shown on this map as these little red circles. And clonal raider ants have much smaller population sizes than army ants, with only 150 to 600 individuals. And they don't do mass raids, but they do a different type of group hunting behavior that's called group raids, and it's the main subject of this paper. And most importantly, clonal raider ants are really good lab animals. They do well in small colonies, and we can keep those colonies living in the lab for years without a problem. So let's just briefly mention the specific questions the researchers tried to answer in this paper. So first, what happens during a clonal raider ant group raid? And second, how are group raid and mass raid behaviors evolutionarily related? So one last note before we get into the data. There are a number of different ways to address scientific questions, and this paper uses a few of them, and I just want to lay that out here. So first, the authors try to break down and classify the steps of a group raid and categorize them into different phases so they can understand that kind of behavior piece by piece, and then they'll be able to compare elements between different conditions and across different species. Second, they run experiments where they alter the conditions that the ants are in and then test whether their hypotheses about how the behavior will change are true or not. Third, they use prior knowledge about how ant species are related to each other to try to understand how two different types of features, like doing group raids or doing mass raids, have evolved over time. So that was a lot of prelude, but now it's time to see what the researchers actually did. The key to this paper is that the authors got clonal raider ants to do their group raid behavior in the lab under controlled conditions. So to do that, they put together these nice little experimental setups in which you have a small nest chamber in which you can house ants. In this case, they have 25 ants in the chamber. And they put the ants in for several days, let them get used to the environment, and they are connected to a large open foraging arena, but the connection's initially blocked. So after the ants have acclimated, they can remove the block, then the ants can explore, and they're eventually going to find a piece of food, which has been dyed blue in this case so that you can see it more easily on the video. So now I'm going to run the video, and you're going to see what happens when an ant is doing a group raid. So this individual up here is searching, she's scouting right now, and we have computer tracking that's showing the path this ant is taking by a little colored line. So she's found the food, she's interacting with it, maybe deciding whether it's good or not. We don't exactly know what's happening here. But after a little while, she's going to start returning towards the nest. And you can see that she's walking in kind of a waggly pattern. And you can't see it, but she's laying a pheromone trail as she goes. She goes into the nest, and then the rest of the ants respond. So we say that they have been recruited to follow the pheromone trail that the first ant laid, and they're brought right back to that piece of food. And what happens next is that the ants sit on the food for several minutes and eventually slowly drag it back into the nest. But I'm not going to show you that part of the video because it's a little too slow. In any case, this experimental setup is really successful for getting group raids to happen, and it allowed the authors to break down the phases of a group raid in pretty good detail. So now I'm going to show you the phases as they are categorized in this paper. So first is the search phase, in which small numbers of individual ants leave the nest and wander around until they bump into food. After the ant finds the food, she takes a waggly path back to the nest and lays a pheromone trail as she does so. And when she gets back to the nest, she does recruitment so that the rest of the ants will respond. So in the response phase, the other ants follow the trail and get to the food. Next is what the authors call the pre-retrieval phase, in which the ants mostly just sit on top of the food, or a few of them will walk back and forth between the food and the nest, but the food isn't moving and the ants aren't actually doing anything that we can tell. So one of the authors actually called this phase originally the mucking about phase, because he really didn't know what the ants were doing. But unfortunately, that term didn't make it into the final publication. In any case, eventually the ants will retrieve the food, and that happens by individual ants grabbing the piece of food and pulling it short distances sequentially along the trail until it gets into the nest. Once the food's in the nest, the ants gradually leave the arena behind and go back to doing ant things and living their little ant lives inside of the nest, taking care of the larvae and eating and things like that. So these are the phases. They happen more or less the same every time. It's really cool. This is possible because we have really good experimental control in the lab. These arenas are all the same. We can run the experiment under basically the same conditions every time, can run it many times and identify the patterns. And we can get high quality video recordings that allow us to track the positions of all the ants all the time. And these are huge advantages for doing science, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that we don't know if everything would happen the same way if the ants were in the wild. Organisms tend to do pretty different things in the field and the wild because the environment that you're in has a really strong effect on what you decide to do. So just keep that in mind when drawing conclusions from lab experiments. So now let's narrow in on a particular part of the group raid. The researchers were really intrigued by the step that they call the recruitment response, where one ant gets a bunch of others to go to the food. So watching a bunch of these group raids showed that the scout coming back to the nest triggered the other ants to drop what they're doing pretty quickly. And they hypothesized that maybe the scout ant was releasing an attractive signal, which drew them towards the source of that signal. So the other possibility is that maybe the signal caused the ants to leave the nest, evacuate, or start following trails or something. But so that to test whether it was really an attractive signal on its own, they designed a new experimental setup. So this time there's two foraging arenas that are both connected to a single nest, but the nest has been split in half with a porous barrier. So the ants can't touch each other, but airflow can still happen. And now they repeat the experiment, and you can see that an ant on this side has gotten to a piece of food, and she's soon going to go try to do recruitment in the nest, and keep an eye on what the ants on the two sides of the barrier are doing. So recruitment happens, ants on the same side of the barrier go to the food, and the other ants, they stay in the nest, and it kind of looks like maybe you saw that they ran into the wall. So let's look at a couple snapshots to get a better idea of what the ants were actually doing. So here we're seeing two overlaid snapshots from before the recruitment in red and after the recruitment in blue. And you can see that the ants on the correct side of the wall went from inside the nest to the trail outside the nest, whereas the ants on the other side of the wall went from scattered within the nest to right up against the wall. So it does really look like the signal caused them to run into the wall. And now let's look at a quantification of this response, which is done from assessing the behavior of many ants across different trials. And so here we're just plotting the distance between the ants on this side of the barrier before recruitment and then after recruitment. So plotting it over time. And what you see is that a few seconds after the recruitment happened, the distance between the ants and the barrier dropped. So this is pretty good evidence that the signal really is something that's just attractive. The scout ant returns to the nest, she does something, and the other ants go towards her. And then there's one more question, which is what type of signal was it? And you can imagine that there could be a few different possible types of attractive signals out there. But by our prior knowledge of ants, and especially these ants, and looking closely at the data, we can come up with a guess as to what the signal might be. So first thing to know is that clonal writer ants are basically blind, so it's very unlikely that there's any kind of visual signal. Second is that these ants are not known to use any kind of sound-based signal. Third, they can't touch each other, so it's not anything tactile. Fourth, if you look carefully at this graph, you can see that the recruitment happens here, and then the response actually didn't happen for a few seconds, which is slow enough that we think it's probably not sound, and it's actually consistent with it being airflow. So the best guess is that the ant probably released a chemical into the air, or a pheromone, which attracted the other ants towards her. And this is also consistent with what we know about ants, because ants use lots of pheromones in their communications. This would probably just be one more to add to the repertoire of how ants pass information to one another. So now that we've learned a bit about how group raids work, it's time to start thinking about how group raids are related to mass raids. So first, I want to remind you how scientists write out ancestry relationships, and we'll use cat species as an example. So this is a phylogenetic tree which shows the relationships among cat species. And the connections between each type of cat show how recently they split. So if you trace from the lion to the leopard, and you track the distance of the horizontal lines, you can see that it's pretty short. It's shorter than the other branches on this tree. So we can say that the lion and the leopard are pretty close relatives. But if you trace from the lion all the way back over here and down to the domestic cats, the length of that horizontal branch is much longer. So we can say that the lion and the domestic cats are relatively distant relatives. And the last thing is that we can also think about family groups on this tree. So we can say that the lion, the leopard, and the jaguar are all in a similar family group with one another relative to the tiger or domestic cat. So though, of course, there's lots of different family groups you could identify in the tree, and this is just one example. So now let's go back to thinking about ants. The authors in this paper were interested in the ancestral relationships around army ants. So they put together a tree showing the ancestral relationships between different genera. And recall that a genus or multiple genera is a taxonomic grouping that's just above species. So within Native Myrmex, for example, there are multiple species. And this tree shows the relationship among all the different genera. And they've colored the bars black if the species or genus is a non-army ant, and red if it is an army ant. And you should be able to see that the way it works out is that there are two family groups of army ants. One of them that is labeled as the New World army ants, which live in the Americas, and another which is labeled as the Old World army ants. And so by looking at this tree and seeing that these two groups are well separated from one another, and in fact, both of them have a bunch of closer relatives which are not army ants themselves, we can say that it's most likely that being an army ant evolved twice independently, once in the Old World and once in the New World, leading to these two different groups. And now let's look at some of the features of these different types of ants. So we can add information to the tree, like the population size. So we're doing a really rough breakdown of population here into either less than 10,000 individuals, in which case it's labeled gray, or more than 10,000 individuals, in which case it's labeled as black. And what you can see is that for all of the non-army ants in which the population size is known, they're gray. So non-army ants have small population sizes, whereas all of the army ants where the population size is known are labeled in black. So all the army ants have big population sizes. So now let's add another piece of information to the tree. This time we're showing the type of hunting behavior that the ants in these groups do. So we're showing group raids in green, and we're showing mass raids in purple. And you should be able to see that these colorings, again, correspond pretty much perfectly with whether the ants are army ants or non-army ants, and also whether they are large population size or small population size. So we can put that together and we can say the original ants in this group, the ancestral ants, had a small population size and they did group raids. At some point, two groups of ants switched from doing group raids to doing mass raids. At this, apparently the same time, they switched from having small colony sizes to having big colony sizes. And this leads to the hypothesis that perhaps the change in colony size is the most important factor that allows something that was not an army ant to start behaving more like a real army ant. And so for the rest of the paper, we're going to start to try and test this hypothesis and see whether changing the group size really does cause the behavior of something that normally does group raids to be more like mass raids and thus more similar to the behavior of these army ants. So to test the hypothesis, the researchers took their experiment setup and they modified it by putting more ants inside of the nest. So here's a video with 50 ants in the nest instead of 25 like we had before. And you're going to see that the behavior is a little bit different this time. So instead of having single scouts who go and search for the food basically on their own, you're going to see, looking inside the nest, there's a little bit of movement. There's ants walking around, walking towards the entrance, and maybe walking a little bit out and then going back in. And then a few more ants, they go peek out and they go back in. And this behavior is kind of increasing, and the ants are going further and further until it kind of looks like there's a flow of ants out of the nest, and then they're going to make it to the food, and the rest of the raid steps are going to continue. So on first glance, this is intriguing. It's a little bit more like a mess raid than like the typical group raid. So we no longer see the single scouts, and instead we saw ants taking little excursions out of the nest and dipping back in and going a little further each time. And that's actually something that's been observed in the wild previously, and it's been given the name of a pushing party, because it sort of looks like the ants are kind of pushing each other a little bit and then ducking back, and then the collective motions of multiple ants are slowly producing this kind of flow out of the nest. At least that was the idea in the researchers' minds who observed that behavior for the first time. So the researchers here do some quantitative analysis on these types of raids to test whether these are really consistent patterns, and whether we can say these mass raid-like behaviors are really happening with more with increasing group size. So the first step is that we're going to do an analysis of how far the ants went on their successive little excursions out of the nest. So every time ants left the nest, they plotted how far they went, and then they do some ranking of the different events and produce a chart where, as you move along the x-axis, you're basically getting later and later in the video, and as you move up the y-axis, you're getting longer and longer excursions. And what you can see is that the early excursions usually don't go very far, but as you get towards later excursions, they are starting to go further and further distances. And this seems to be a trend. And it's, again, consistent with the idea that excursions are getting further and further. And that's a bit different from the single ant scouting behaviors, which you typically see in the group raids. It's a little bit more like the mass raids. And next, we're going to look at another feature of the mass raiding behavior, which is coordination of excursions in time. So this graph is showing events where an ant left the nest, and we have plotted them for group size 10, group size 20, group size 50, and group size 100. And what you can see is that in the group size 10, there's not very many events, and they're kind of spread out. And as you have more and more ants, you get more and more excursions, as you might expect. But you may or may not be able to see a change in the pattern here, where, especially up here, it kind of looks like a lot of the ants are leaving together instead of having their excursions being totally spaced out. But it almost looks like they're sort of clumping or coordinating their behavior to leave at the same time as one another. So the researchers did a quantitative analysis on these excursion events and showed that as you increase the colony size, you get an increase in the coordination of the ants' excursion events. And so this is showing that small colony sizes, you get ants kind of leaving more at random. Whereas as the colony size gets larger, ants start to coordinate with one another, kind of leave at the same time, which is another feature that is more consistent with an army ant mass raid than with a group raid. So putting it together, it does seem like increasing sizes of colonies does lead to more mass raid-like behavior. And it just by altering the group size, you are getting a change in the way that the ant as a collective is behaving, which is kind of cool. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about from this paper is one kind of final test of the hypothesis. So recall that the real army ant mass raid behavior has a kind of a structure like this seen from an aerial view. So you have the nest, you have a long column of ants, and then you have a splitting of the column as the ants go to different food sources, and you have traffic of individuals along the different branches between the food and the nest. And so what would happen if you were to make a really big clonal raider ant colony? Would you actually start to see structures that really resemble this mass raid? So the researchers decided to try it. And I told you before that clonal raider ant colonies are usually only a few hundred individuals max, but in the lab, it is possible to grow them to larger sizes. And so we have colonies with thousands or tens of thousands of individuals. So the authors took one of these huge colonies with about 5,000 individuals and put them in a big bucket and gave them food sources and saw what they did. And this is a snapshot of the results. So now you can see the nest, you can see ants trafficking along what looks almost like a raiding column, and you can see ants clustering around several different food sources and trafficking between them. So now this collective behavior is starting to resemble, in some ways, more like the army ant mass raid. And it's kind of satisfying to see that you can get this pattern to emerge just by giving larger numbers of ants. I do want to say that there are some caveats to this experiment. So, namely, this is still a lot smaller, both in terms of population, because it's about 5,000 ants, which is still 100 times smaller population than an actual army ant colony. And the physical size is also a lot smaller, because if you look closely, you'll see that the scale bar here is only 6 centimeters, where over here it actually represents 2 meters. And of course, this experiment was done in the lab under artificial conditions, and we don't really know if clonal raider ants would still do this kind of behavior in the wild. Still, it's intriguing. So that's where I'm pretty much going to leave it. And I just want to end by asking a few questions that I had that remain unanswered at the end of this paper. So maybe just things you can keep in mind, or to get your mind going if you are trying to come up with a question of your own. So, I'm actually on my summary slide because I'm not reading my slides as carefully as maybe I should. So just to summarize what we learned, group raids consist of multiple reliable phases, and we saw them broken down. They can be reliably run in the lab multiple times using clonal raider ants. We found that recruitment to a food source uses an attractive signal that's probably a pheromone. We learned that group raiding behavior evolved first and was later modified into mass raiding behavior with the emergence of army ants. And we also found that group raids get more like army ant mass raids when you increase the population size of a clonorator ant colony. So now here are my aforementioned questions that I was left with. So the first question that I had is, are we really convinced that that mass raids are just group raids at large colony size? We saw a few different indications that the group raiding behavior was getting more like a mass raid, but there are still a lot of other things you could test. And for example, it would be really cool to see what they do in a natural environment as opposed to this artificial lab environment. Another question is, what's happening during the pre-retrieval phase that I mentioned, where the ants really just are sitting on the food for a few minutes before they take it back to the nest? It's kind of just makes us curious about what's going on in the mind of the ant when they're doing that. Future experiments could maybe try to figure out what the purpose of that phase is. And then one last question. We saw in this experiment that if you take a clonorator ant colony that is, and you make it bigger, you can get them to go from doing group raids to doing something that's more like a mass raid. But what if you went in the opposite direction and took a real army ant colony and decreased the population size? Would they start to do group raids instead? I don't have the answers to these questions, but it'd be cool if someone were to actually go out and solve them.